if you don't live on an island, then your country shares at least one border with another country, right? So in the case of Germany, we're talking about 9 other countries. That's almost 4,000 kilometers or 2,400 miles of border. And because Germany is surrounded by European friends, you can normally cross those borders without being checked. And that freedom of movement, as it's called, is considered one of the biggest accomplishments of the European peace project since the end of the Second World War. But the situation has been changing. If you're traveling in Europe at the moment, expect long queues at the German-Polish border for the next few weeks or months to come. Why? Well, Poland announced this week that it is going to start implementing regular border controls as of next week. Why are they doing that? Well, you started it, they're telling their German neighbours. So how did we get here? What does that mean for European unity at a time when it's needed more than ever? And could it be that the German government is actually not that unhappy about the criticism it's receiving? Well, we'll talk about all of that on today's Berlin briefing. Over on the line, we have David McQuaid in Warsaw, former Bloomberg and Dow Jones bureau chief in Poland. Thank you very much for joining us, David. Looking forward to your insights from, what's been debated in Poland. The situation there is obviously also very intense. Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister, is under a lot of pressure there. You've just seen a new president elected in the country. So what does all of that contribute to the debate and to those measures that are now being implemented? And here in the studio with me are Michaela Küfner, Chief Political Editor, and Bernd Riegert, and those are, of course, familiar faces and voices of our regular Berlin briefing audience. Bernd has all the knowledge about the EU. We've actually done an episode on Friedrich Merz's migration gamble, but we did that before those measures were put into place. So if you want to go back, do and check out that episode, because a lot of the things that are happening we actually predicted at the time. But maybe, Michaela, we can start with you. Can you just sum up to somebody who's watching, say, from the US, how on earth did we get here?
Yes, well, first of all, we had an election and we had a big election promise by Friedrich Merz ahead of those February elections that there would be a migration turnaround, that there would be a clampdown on migration. The previous government had already started sporadic checks at the border as early as October 2023. Those were then intensified. And then before those February elections, there were several shock events. One of them was a man driving into a Christmas market in Magdeburg, a Saudi Arabian man who didn't fit any kind of mold of expectations of someone conducting such an attack. He was actually anti-Islamist. And then there was an attack in Aschaffenburg where a man from Syria who no longer should have been in Germany, he should have already have been sent back to Bulgaria where he initially claimed asylum, stabbed a toddler to death and a man, and questions were raised how this can happen. And this all was kind of the sentiment under which those elections were conducted. So it was time to fulfill the promise. And as soon as Friedrich Merz was elected, the day after, he traveled to Paris as the key partner, but also to Warsaw.
You were there
Poland.
with him,
Yes,
right?
I was there with him. And on that very same day, his interior minister, Alexander Dobrindt, started implementing sending people back at the German border. Important differentiation to pushbacks. It was sending people back even if they wanted to claim asylum.
Because that was the new thing, right? I mean, they said from now on, it's not enough to say that you are looking to apply for asylum to be let into the country. We're even going to reject certain people who do that at the border.
Exactly. And there's a whole question over whether this is legal under European law. But up until that point, if someone appeared at the German border, also within the European Union, and said the word asylum, at least their claim needed to be checked. There also needed to be a check whether they already applied for asylum elsewhere. And this is new. And this is an element the government sees as implementing their promise to be tougher on migration. And I was there with Friedrich Merz on that very day, traveling to Warsaw, and we did see him with Donald Tusk at their press conference, and it was a very carefully coordinated back and forth where, of course, Donald Tusk was not happy about the German government, incoming government, doing this. He was fearing a lashback at the presidential elections that followed shortly after in Poland. And as we now know, the peace candidate did win those elections. So this turned against Donald Tusk. It's making his life a lot harder governing Poland. And now we're seeing Poland arguably react amongst an atmosphere of rumors, one can safely say, because we're also seeing rumors spread that allegedly Germany is sending rejected asylum claimants into Poland, which Friedrich Merz is very keen to stress wherever he goes is not true.
And we can get into that a bit later. I would like to get the perspective from Poland right now. David, if you could just sum up to us and to our viewers and listeners, how was that German debate perceived where you are in Warsaw? And, how did people react to that turnaround when it comes to migration and asylum policies that the new German government actually not only implemented, but tried to put into force?
Well, with great concern, especially on the part of the government, because remember, going back a few months, that Donald Tusk's position in Europe was extremely strong, but he was considered to be the man who showed how it was possible to defeat the right and the Eurosceptic right in the 2023 elections. Well, that story has shifted, and it shifted, I think, in part because of what's happened in Germany. Merz, Merz, and the Christian Democratic, the CDU-CSU-led government was something that Tusk had been hoping for a long, long time, hoping to work hand in hand with Merz, which so far, in fact, they've done on issues like Ukraine, even on issues like standing up to the U.S. and the Donald Trump administration on trade and other issues, taking a relatively tough line. But Merz, of course, has his own domestic political imperatives, and those imperatives were, to be credible on migration, that we're going to get tough, and that unfortunately has made life extremely difficult for Donald Tusk. And the political timing could not be worse. The government has had a major reverse, which may in fact threaten its survival with the loss of the presidential election to a peace-back candidate, Nawrocki, who quite possibly
Peace is the name of the party, right? So it's not PAC.
That's right. Peace, PIS. That's right. That's the Law and Justice. It's and this populist right party has made both opposition to immigration, opposition to the EU's migrant pact, and also tension and hostility and suspicion towards Germany a centerpiece of its election appeal. And so to have an issue now, and Peace and another right-wing party, Confederacja, which is also the Confederation, which is also gaining in strength, it's even farther to the right than Peace, with even some anti-Semitic overtones and pro-Russian overtones to it. These two parties have seized upon this issue as being an absolute winner for them. And they have helped organize these vigilante, if you want to call it, citizens patrols that we've been seeing on the border, alleging that Poland is being flooded with people who are being deported back from Germany, either under Dublin III, which was this, EU agreement to repatriate illegal migrants back to their country of entry, which in this case in Germany would be Poland, for example, or simply dump them over the Polish border. Now, there is almost no data to back that up. Almost all the hard data we've got through the first quarter of 1995 indicates that, in fact, the numbers of Dublin III repatriees have been declining. They were about 800 last year per month, and they've gone down to about 720 in the first quarter of this month. So there isn't any statistical evidence, at least according to the border data. But we do have Tusk's own comment that the situation has significantly worsened over the last month, although he didn't provide any data to back that up, so we don't know exactly what he was referring to. And more than anything else, it's a question of perceptions in Polish politics, may be more important than reality. We have, after this disastrous loss in the presidential election, there's been a recent poll that shows that 51% of respondents, 51% of the Polish public, believes that that the government has lost control over the borders. And this contrasts with the efforts of the government over the last year and a half, billions spent on border defense, tightening up the border. A whole division's worth of Polish troops are now backing up the border guards on the Belarusian and Russian borders to the east. And there's been significant progress, obviously much less attempts to illegally cross the border, at least on the Polish side, than there were under the previous government 2 or 3 years ago. But now this has gone up in smoke, and the government, this current government, is in a tailspin, and their poll figures are dropping dramatically. The party support figures show them dropping 6 to 7 percentage points over the past month. So right now, Tusk is fighting a fire, and he's got to, just for his domestic situation, very much the same way that Merz has to worry about the right in Germany, and he has to be tough on migration. Tusk is feeling perhaps now even more intense pressure in Poland.
And maybe, Bernd, we can pull you in to talk a bit about the scope, because David has already hinted at it. Is this really a serious problem where, risking European unity is worth it because you really need to address the number of people crossing in an uncontrolled manner from Poland into Germany and the other way around?
Well, if it comes to Poland, let's introduce some facts and figures here. Poland is one of the countries in the EU that receives the least applicants of asylum whatsoever, 15,000 last year. And 2,600 of them were going further on to Germany, and then they were rejected at the border in Germany, which is legal as long as they don't claim asylum. So these people are not entering Germany technically. They are still in Poland, so it's Poland's duty to process them. And you should also see that Poland should better protect its external border to Belarus, and to Belarus especially, because most of the people come through that way. So under European law, the Polish authorities would be obliged to process the people in Poland. They can do that close at the border or at centers. And if the people try to go on to Germany, then Germany has the right to send them back, unless they claim asylum at the border in Germany. But those people were only, when I see it correctly, 184 in the first 6 months.
This is not 184,000, this is 184.
184. So this can technically not be a problem, for Poland to... But of course, Poland can argue this is illegal under European law. You cannot send them back if they claim asylum in Germany. Then Germany is responsible to process and to check if they can be sent back to Poland, because they entered Poland as the first country of entry. Then you can also send them back to Poland. But at least they have the right to a process in Germany. It's a very complicated rule, but this was also agreed amongst all European countries. Poland, Germany, everybody agreed on these Dublin rules. They are called Dublin because the original conference was in Dublin in the 90s, actually. So this system is there. And if you follow these rules, then there shouldn't be a problem. And this is all due to political things in Poland, as we've heard. So if you see the numbers are not an explanation for that, actually. And if Poland and Germany, if the governments want to change something, they have to change the European rules that they have to adhere to.
Yeah.
So
and that is probably, or it is possibly, the biggest motivation for the Merz government, right? That they want to exert pressure on Germany's 9 neighbouring countries, to sort of change the ways that the European Union deals with freedom of movement. So protect it, but change the way that the external borders are protected as well, right, Michaela?
I know from background talks that this incoming government is banking on knock-on effects, that less people then try to come to the Union altogether, less people try and move on from their first country of entry. The whole irony of the Dublin system, of course, is that on paper it looks like those countries with no external border will be fine. Nobody will go there because everybody will just remain in
that's what the Germans want.
Exactly.
In theory, that would be the case.
That's actually why Germany felt it was a great deal for them. In practice, it worked out actually quite the contrary, that most people simply want to move on, and that the countries who have these external borders feel left alone in not having enough resources and enough commitment from other countries to protect the external borders, but also have in the past felt rather comfortable waving goodbye to those asylum seekers who wanted to move on, and most of them wanted to move to Germany, France, or Britain even. So, but in terms of being able to forward, like politically, clearly neither Donald Tusk nor German Chancellor Merz can afford to be seen as not clamping down on migration. The economic question is something else. And this is where I'd love to ask David, because Germany exports 60%, it's an export economy, exports 60% into the European Union. A third of Polish exports almost come to Germany. So my question is, what's your prediction? How long is this sustainable until there's a different price to pay, which then puts pressure on governments to roll back these border checks?
Well, Poland's leading economic newspaper, Rzeczpospolita, led with that today. There would be a serious economic price to pay if these border controls continue for a long time, because the German and Polish economies are very closely intertwined. Poland's very important for Germany, too. A lot of the supply chain for key German manufacturers starts in Poland. And this is just going to mess up logistics entirely. So perhaps one would hope that these controls would be a temporary measure to let things calm down politically. But the problem is probably a political chain reaction, which is that certain things that Merz has done in Germany, which are completely understandable, can have unexpected and very negative for Germany repercussions in other countries, as in Poland. For example, if the result of this to improve his domestic political situation is that Merz is confronted, in 2 years, if we have a normal parliamentary term, or even earlier, if there's a snap election, if he's confronted with a very hostile right-led government, let's say of Confederacja and peace in Poland, then the problems both for Berlin and Warsaw get much, much worse.
And we've been there before, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, not just for Berlin and Warsaw, but that also means, the power of the Weimar Triangle, for example, would diminish, and that would be really bad news for Ukraine, because, of course, France, Germany and Poland are the main players within the European Union to drive support for Ukraine here from the European allies. I just want to play one soundbite from Friedrich Merz so that we hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, that he explains the motivation why the German government feels it is necessary. So let's just listen to that.
We currently have to carry out border controls because the protection of Europe's external borders is not sufficiently guaranteed. We know that this is a temporary measure. We know that this measure also entails some restrictions in border traffic. We want to minimize these restrictions as much as possible.
And of course, we also need to hear from the Polish side, so from Donald Tusk. And he's under a lot of pressure from the Law and Justice Party in Poland, whose leader Jarosław Kaczynski wrote on X that Germany regularly deports illegal migrants over to Poland and that therefore is causing chaos in the country. Let's hear what Donald Tusk responded.
Czasowe przywrócenie kontroli na granicy polsko-niemieckiej.
We consider the temporary restoration of controls at the German-Polish border to be necessary in order to limit and minimise these flows, which are not controlled by our services, and the comings and goings of migrants crossing the German-Polish border. This decision has certain consequences for the free movement of people, but the mission of the border guards is in fact to effectively block unjustified and unauthorised returns of migrants by the German side. If such have taken place, and in order to be able to control this process, border controls must be reinstated. There is no other solution.
Nie ma innej drogi.
So an intense debate in Poland about whether or not Germany is in fact using migrants to cause chaos in the neighbouring countries. And one of our colleagues actually confronted the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz with those claims, and he rejected that strongly. Let's listen to that.
Es gibt aus Deutschland
There are no deportations from Germany of asylum seekers who've already arrived in Germany back to Poland. Such deportations do not exist, and they will not exist. It is sometimes claimed that there is something like organised deportation tourism from Germany to Poland, and that these people are in effect sent back across the border to Poland. But that is not the case. There are no such cases. There are refusals at the German borders, meaning the European internal borders, Germany's external borders. And we're discussing with Poland, just as we do with Luxembourg, how we can keep the burdens as low as possible, and how we can really only record those cases where there's an attempt at illegal border crossing. Perhaps I should also add that we're talking with the Polish government about joint controls in respective border areas, both on the German side and on the Polish side. And I can only say that there's a very close and very collegial, friendly cooperation between the heads of government. That is, between Donald Tusk and me, as well as between the interior ministers, because we want to solve a common problem together.
And you can look at polls and see how this new policy, this new stance on migration is actually benefiting the German Conservatives here. The numbers after the elections earlier this year for the Conservatives went down. The AfD polls went up. But since those increased border controls were announced, you see that the AfD has been losing support. I mean, not dramatically, but constantly. They have now gone down some 2 or 3%, and the Conservatives are the clear benefiters of this policy. So are we going to see the Conservatives change course, Michaela? What do you expect? It's working for them, right?
Well, it could be down to the migration policy, but probably not that alone. I think it's safe to say that Friedrich Merz, you can also see it in his personal popularity ratings, which are now going up, that he seems to have convinced potential voters in faraway elections that he might be the right man in the job. And I think what plays into that is also his visit at the Oval Office, visiting Donald Trump. He was at the G7, he was at NATO. He has given a new, fresh take on German foreign policy. So
he announced a big investment package for the economy.
Huge investment package. He has a lot of cash on the table that he can spend because the debt brake has now been suspended completely for defense spending, and there's extra money available in terms of debt also for much needed investment. So this is a whole package. But I think it's fair to say also, because we're seeing Alexander Dobrindt, the interior minister who's responsible for this policy, who has to implement it, his ratings go up. I think it's safe to say that the whole rhetoric and tough action on migration is working for him in the polls. It's interesting to see that we saw that also in the polling, that this is an issue that was very much weighing on people's minds going into an election. So he's now accused of not keeping his promise in terms of the debt brake and spending, but he clearly is determined to keep his promise on making a difference on migration. But again, the question is what the political damage will be within the European Union as a whole unless, of course, they find a new consensus fast.
And of course, the German government is already in a legal difficulty, or in some cases there are legal cases now that have been filed by people who feel like the German government is not behaving in accordance with EU rules. Is that something, I wonder, Bernd, where you feel the German government is also testing just how long it's going to take courts to deal with certain political measures that they're implementing? And in the worst case, they'll just say, oh, well, now, 2 years later, for example, a court has said, no, this is not okay, you need to change your rules. But in the meantime, their tough stance is appreciated by the German public, by German voters, so it's worth risking that.
Well, my impression is also, judging from some background meetings, that they just try it. I mean, they know they can do it now, and the effect on the public is positive, so let's do it, regardless if it's legal or illegal under European laws. And they know it, actually, that this is illegal. Most of them are lawyers, so they know what they're doing. But they just try, because until these cases crawl up the courts and at some point end up in Luxembourg or the European Court of Justice, that will take years. And then, of course, facts are implemented already on the ground. So it's it's maybe a kind of a Trump-like approach, just do it and then see what happens. I think this is risky, because in the end, of course, the credibility of the German government in Europe could suffer. But other countries are doing it as well. I mean, there are pushbacks on the Croatian border, there are pushbacks on the Polish border, actually. So they know that they cannot do that, actually, but they do it because for internal reasons, they have to do it, or they think they have to do it. So it's a big test and a stress test also for the European legal system and for the rule of law in Europe as such. But as I said, if you want to change that, change the European rules. But this is not possible, because all member states have different interests. The member states at the border, like Poland or Italy or Spain, they don't want to keep all these applicants in their own countries. And the countries in the middle, like Austria or Germany, they don't want to receive people that should be in other countries. So this conflict has not been resolved over the last 10 years. And also the next migration reform, the so-called Migration Pact that is due to come into effect next year, will not solve this.
And actually, Poland is not the only country that Friedrich Merz is challenging with his tough stance on migration, and Alexander Dobrindt, of course. We're talking about 9 neighboring countries, and when Luxembourg's Luc Frieden was here and spoke to Friedrich Merz, he also addressed that issue sort of in an understanding way. We need to do more to protect our external borders. Maybe let's just listen to what Luc Frieden said.
Luxembourg has only one external border, that is the airport. But we also know what exists in Italy, Greece, Poland and elsewhere is also our border. That's why we have a responsibility to strengthen these external borders.
And David, I want to bring you back in from Warsaw. What do you see as a perspective in terms of strengthening the EU's external borders? Because that is essentially the message that we're hearing from all prime ministers, from leaders of state and government here in Europe, that more needs to be done, because, as Bernd just said, the system so far is clearly not working in a convincing manner. What is Poland currently thinking about? Does it get support from other European allies to strengthen its external borders? If you could just give us an idea of that.
It's gotten some support, but the feeling is not nearly enough. And there is a lot of, tension and resentment here. The idea that as an external country, it's spent a lot of money and taken extreme measures to improve border security with mixed results. But most of the data that we have indicates that illegal crossings have decreased dramatically over the last couple of years. how reliable they are, because there's a lot of movement that's not captured by the statistics, and some of it, for example, there's a lot that's going through initially crossing into Lithuania and then over the internal border from Lithuania to Poland. That apparently is not being captured. But anyway, from the data that we have available, it appears that there's progress. But the problem is that it's a very long external border with Kaliningrad, which is Russia, Belarus, Ukraine to a certain extent as well. And this is very difficult to police. I mean, the other issue is that Poland says, why are we not getting more financing for some of our border and border security and border defense measures from the rest of the EU, given that we're already spending twice as much on defense, if you measure by GDP per capita, than, let's say, Germany is. And Germany's not the worst defender by far in the EU, especially after the Merz government took over. So there's a feeling, I think there's a feeling in Warsaw that, there are lots of nice words of support coming from the rest of the EU, but there's not nearly enough money. And Poland's, especially with 5% of GDP next year being spent on defense, plus a lot of other spending, including benefit spending as well, Poland's fiscal situation is actually pretty dire.
And what do you expect is going to happen, David, if we could sort of all think about, where is this going to end? How are Germany and Poland going to deal with this pressure that they want to appear tough on migration? They're under domestic pressure from far-right parties in particular. We also know that Russia has been using migration as a very popular tool to instill fear in voters in Europe. What do you expect is going to happen with that topic?
Well, your last point is really well chosen, because Poland and other countries are really on the receiving end of some major hybrid war measures from Russia and disinformation. My feeling is this. I mean, Merz and Tusk, Poland and Germany are natural allies on a lot of these issues. They need to work together. And it seems to me that Merz and Tusk, who are both experienced politicians, either have to figure a way to get their messaging in sync and start working together, both in terms of getting across the point that they're not minimizing the migration problem, that they're taking active measures to contain it, but that the way to do this is to work together, maybe on because both of them may have some issues with the migration pact, maybe to outline or accentuate bilateral cooperation first. That message needs to get across. But the problem is it's extremely difficult, especially in Poland, when you've got a right and a far right that's on the ascendancy. I mean, the last election indicates that you have three parties that could be described as ranging from either Trumpist right all the way to AfD or to neo-fascist. You have three parties that would get into parliament together, accounting for about 50% of the electorate. So we really have, at this point, an alt-right Trumpist moment in the offing in Poland. And really, the main cleavage issue they're using is migration and anti-EU message, that the EU and certainly Germany will not lift a finger to help us with these issues. And so other European leaders, but in this case, I think preeminently, Merz and Tusk have got to find a way to put together a convincing counter message. And if they can't, I think that this government in Poland, the current government in Poland, is a lame duck government, and that in a couple of years, if not sooner, Europe may discover that the EU may discover that it's got another huge problem child, in this case much bigger than Orban and Hungary.
And Ben, your last thoughts on that? What is at risk here when you look at European unity?
Well, I think the situation will go on for a while, these checks at internal borders, and it also depends on how they actually do them. These checks are not closing the border and checking every truck and every lorry that is coming. It's just, looking into the cars and then say maybe, maybe not. but still, this is causing frictions and interruptions also in the economic sphere already. But if the Chancellor says we can only resolve this if the external borders are better protected, what does he mean by that? Clothing the external borders altogether?
Building a fence.
We have fences already in many places in Europe. So, but if you want to close the border altogether, then you have to leave the Geneva Convention, because people that arrive at the border have the right to claim asylum. This is the law, actually. So you cannot close it completely. If you want to do that, then you have to think about getting rid of the right of asylum, like other parts of the world did. So, then you can fence yourself in and lift the internal borders. But until this step is not taken or even discussed, then it's very difficult to come to a point. But there were some people in the CDU and the Conservatives who thought about that last year, but I've not heard from them since. I don't know if this discussion is still going on, but this would be the radical solution then.
So thank you. This is very likely not the last episode we'll be doing on migration in Europe. And of course, we'd like to hear your thoughts. So do send them to us via YouTube if you found us there, or via your regular podcast provider. We'd love for you to subscribe, of course. And also you can do that to our newsletter, Berlin Briefing, where you can read up on this and many other issues that are making headlines here. It comes out once a week, just like this podcast. Thanks. Until next time.